It's time for Global Insights, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Now, North Korea test-fired what appeared to be 5 artillery pieces into the West Sea on Sunday, according to Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff. And this just came days after North Korean leader Kim Jong Un called for stronger defense measures against external threats, and a week after the regime shot 8 missiles. As geopolitical and security tensions mount in the Indo-Pacific region here, especially with North Korea's provocations in recent weeks, the ongoing U.S. China rivalry, as well as the ongoing war in Ukraine, Asia's largest defense summit, the Shangri-La Dialogue, took place in Singapore over the weekend. So we discuss all these latest developments in regional security with Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Head of Department and Professor of International Relations at King's College London, and Jun-seong, Visiting Professor at Yonsei University's Graduate School of International Studies. A very warm welcome to you both. And, well, Professor Pacheco Pardo, beginning with you. Firstly, North Korea's suspected firing of artillery pieces that was reported late Sunday here in South Korea. What do you see as the intention behind this latest provocation from the regime?
Well, it seems to me that North Korea continues to develop its missile program. We imagine also the nuclear program, of course. So I think that North Korea is going to continue with these tests regardless of the geopolitical situation in the region until it feels satisfied with the level of development of its missiles. So I don't think it's a provocation per se, a provocation towards South Korea or the U.S. or the two allies plus Japan as well. But I think it is part of what North Korea would call the normal development of its missile program, because it feels threatened by the U.S. and by South Korea. And I do think that unless at some point there is a dialogue between the two Koreas, between the U.S. and North Korea, Pyongyang will continue with the development of its missile programs without any real interruption.
And Professor An, North Korean leader Kim Jong Un called for stronger self-defense measures against what he called challenges, very serious challenges, he said, as he presided over a ruling party plenary session earlier this week. And, well, amid speculation that the regime is soon going to hold another nuclear weapons test, what do you think is North Korea's approach to its external affairs right now?
Well, as you said, right, I mean, there was a very widespread speculation that North Korea will, nuclear weapon test, sometime soon. But now we know that they had an artillery test yesterday already. And I had 2 observations about his speech, Kim Jong Un's speech, that, well, he just called South Korea as an enemy, right? And also that used to call it like South, North and South relations, but now he called it enemy. And second, that, well, he did not specify whether North Korea would have the weapon test, or did not criticize South Korean government or U.S. government. So put them together. Well, he used self-defense to justify his upcoming nuclear test. Nuclear weapon test. Not only also the military test. Provocation, right? Because I guess he tried to justify whatever he'd like to do, what kind of provocation to the South Korean government. It's not, more like it's not they're saying we're not provoking South Korea or U.S. We're just saying the self-defense. I guess that's their how you want to approach it.
And Professor Pacheco Pardo, the North actually announced a partial reshuffle of its top officials. And, well, Vice Foreign Minister Choi Son-hee, who used to play a key role in denuclearization talks, she's going to be foreign minister, while the foreign minister, Lee Song-gon, has been tapped to lead the party's United Front department, which is tasked with handling inter-Korean relations. So what significance do you see in the timing of this reshuffling and the nature of it as well?
I think it is interesting that this has taken place at a point in time in which North Korea seems to be not very keen on dialogue with South Korea and the U.S. Because if you look at Choi especially, she was key really in the run-up to the Singapore summit, to the Hanoi summit. Then it looked like she had been either demoted, replaced because of the failure of the Hanoi summit. And now we see how she's been appointed as a foreign minister, which suggests that Kim Jong Un wants to have someone in this post who has experience of dialogue or preparing dialogue at the very least with the U.S. and also with South Korea. And I think the appointment of Lee is also in the same direction, someone who is experienced, someone who knows about inter-Korean relations, someone who is or has been involved in preparing dialogues in the past. So it may be that Kim Jong Un is laying the groundwork for a potential dialogue with the US and South Korea in the not too distant future, or at least he's signaling that he would be ready to have a dialogue with the two countries.
And certainly, Professor Pacheco, Pardo, North Korea was definitely on the agenda at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which happened over the weekend, where South Korea's Defense Minister Lee Jong-seong met with his US and Japanese counterparts Lloyd Austin and Nobuo Kishi. And the three of them agreed to identify additional three-way steps to respond to the North's missile threats. And in what kind of form do you expect this to take place?
Well, I would expect that there would be more anti-missile the exercises between the three of them. This is something that has taken place in the past, but not for the past 3 or 4 years. So I would expect that the three of them will resume these exercises, and also I think very importantly that they will be very open, very vocal about these exercises taking place, instead of trying to keep them quiet, not to provoke South Korea. Some people would think that this is provocative towards North Korea. And I would expect also that, well, intelligence sharing has continued over the past few years, but I would also assume that you will see more intelligence sharing between the three of them, and potentially with other partners. We have seen, for example, how Australia now has indicated that it wants to become more involved in dealing with the North Korean nuclear issue. We have also seen condemnation, actually, of North Korea's behavior in recent months by ASEAN. So you might expect more cooperation between the three countries, South Korea, the US, and Japan, together with ASEAN, together with Australia, and it's the same intelligence sharing, information gathering, etc., etc.
Professor Ahn, well, other than the North Korea agenda, what are some key discussions and agreements that South Korea was part of at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year? I mean, did it play a more global or pivotal role as the Yoon administration promised?
Well, I guess that there was many global issues, right, such as the Ukraine war, and then there's U.S. China conflict, right? So I guess that the South Korean government will try to, defense ministry will try to do more global role, right? That's true, right? But I think that we have more impending issue, right, about North Korean threat, nuclear and the missile threat. So I guess that they will focus on the three-way approach with the, Korea, South Korea, U.S. and Japan, and then bilateral approach, right? But the bilateral with the Japanese government did not work out. I guess that's something the South Korean government have to work on the relations, right, to normalize the bilateral relation with Japan. So yeah, and also there's some issue about the bilateral between South Korea and U.S., right? And there was some issue. There have been discussed some issues which has been raised during the recent summit in Seoul. So they will follow up the issues. Also, there will come up with the execution plan to how to handle the situation, right?
Professor Pacheco, Pardo, the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, he emphasized that the Indo-Pacific is the US's main theater of operations, as well as security partnerships, as well as the use of technology. Those 3 points were emphasized in his speech. And, well, Chinese Defense Minister Wei Fenghe, he responded to this, saying that the Indo-Pacific strategy by the US is pushing the two sides towards war. So do you think with these kind of this back and forth between Washington and Beijing, we're going to see heightening military tension in the region?
I think we are heading in that direction. I think we are seeing both the US and China willing to very forcefully express their opinion. None of them wants to back down from their position. From a Chinese perspective, the US is encroaching on its territorial rights, for example, that China feels it has in the South China Sea, of course, over Taiwan as well. And obviously, the US is trying to put together a coalition that will deter Chinese behavior. I don't think anyone expects, of course, a full-blown war, but we could see some clashes. We have seen them in the past by accident, but they did happen. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more of this in the coming months and in the coming years, unless one of the two countries, probably China, is willing to back down from its position. But right now, clearly doesn't seem to be the position or the direction of travel that China is going to take.
And Professor An, what did you make of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's speech? What do you think it really indicated about America's approach to its security competition with China? And do you think this means that Washington is going to seek more from its partners in the Indo-Pacific? And what kind of implications would that have for South Korea?
Yeah, I guess that there will be more demand. I mean, there will be more demand or slash or request from the U.S. government to build up the stronger alliance with the U.S. government, right? So there is more demand, and then South Korean government have to decide it, how we follow, how do they follow with their demand or requests, right? So, but it's different from the economic relations, right? In terms of military relations, right? U.S. is a very, really strong ally to South Korean government, right? So that's the real things we have to think about it, and also not only thinking about, think about the Ukraine situation. So because we have some Korea and Russia relation as well, in things we have to consider. Also the U.S. China relations, while we have to consider about our bilateral with the Chinese government as well. So it's a very complicated issue for international perspective, but still we have to try to strike some balance in how we approach it.
And Professor An, at the NATO summit in Spain this month, there could be a bilateral meeting between President Jun-seong and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. So what are your thoughts on the chances of this meeting happening? And if it does happen, then what would be the main objectives or reasons for holding this potential meeting?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because I have to ask myself to whether there will be any meeting in the bilateral in Spain. But I think that, well, it could happen. But however, there's two conditions, right? Because the problem is before normalizing bilateral with the Japanese government is that the Japanese government, well, we have some unresolved issues between two countries, right? There are many issues actually, not only economics, and then the forced labor issue. There are many very sensitive issues, and the both government have to come together and to resolve it. And second, the Japanese government putting some condition, right, kind of precondition for any bilateral relations, which really kind of prohibit any development of any bilateral relations, to normalize the relations with the Japanese government. So I guess that it will depend on how and when whether and when and Japanese government change their stance, and then where they're willing to talk. And then I hope that is not too late.
Professor Pacheco Pardo, before we go, at the NATO summit in Spain in late June, they'll be coming up with the new strategic concept. So what are you expecting to see? And as for South Korea's role, how do you think it could really tie into that?
Well, if you look at the direction of travel of NATO over the past few years, 5 to 10 years, clearly has been paying more attention to regions outside of Europe itself. It has been focusing on threats outside of Russia. And since the Trump administration came to office, really, NATO has been focusing on China as well. And here is where South Korea really plays a crucial role. NATO has the 4 core Asia-Pacific partners, Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And it wants to cooperate with them in areas such as cybersecurity. Korea is the only Asian country that is part of one of the main groupings to deal with cybersecurity that NATO has. It wants to cooperate more with them when it comes, for example, to missile defense, technology sharing, and they are NATO members, Poland, for example, that buy military technology, acquire military technology from South Korea. So there are many areas for potential cooperation. And even though, obviously, NATO welcomes South Korea's robust position on Ukraine, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think the main interest remains cooperation with Korea and the other Asia-Pacific partners when it comes to dealing with China. There's also a North Korea component, but it is true that for NATO, North Korea is not the main focus. Obviously, Russia is the main one, and after Russia, it is China.
Well, that was Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Head of Department and Professor of International Relations at King's College London, and Jun-seong, visiting Professor at Yonsei University's Graduate School of International Studies. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.